It was the strangest thing, walking into the kitchen for breakfast to find Dad sitting at the table, sober for once. My little sister was already there. She turned to me and smiled cheerily. "Morning." "Hi," I murmured. She continued scoffing the pancakes in front of her. Pancakes? Only Dad got pancakes. We got toast, but today Dad had nothing but an empty plate. I sat down in front of the serving I assumed was mine, but I was hesitant to eat. "Where's Mom?" I asked, no one in particular. "She has a headache," Dad answered. I couldn't meet his eyes. "Eat up. She made them for you." I stuck a fork into my food and ate, all the while staring at the table. I couldn't have been more relieved when it was time for school. It felt like the zone in there. I informed my best friend Stu later. I dawdled home that evening. Things changed sometimes. They got good, but it never lasted more than a few hours a day if we were lucky. And it was always worse after. I almost tripped on Lily's bag when I got in. She dumped it right by the door. I picked it up and made to sneak to our room. She knew Dad hated messes. Now we'd both pay. As I passed the kitchen, I fully expected it to be empty, because Dad sat in the lounge after work. But it wasn't empty. Dad was in there, at the table, exactly where he'd been this morning. Mom was doing the dishes behind him. I froze like a deer in headlights. "Hi, Joe," Dad said. "Hi." The plates and cups clattered in the sink before Mom. "Hey, baby, dinner's at 6. Tell your sister." "Okay," I managed before scuttling to my room. Lily was already in there, lying on her bed and listening to music through headphones. I dropped her bag and snatched the headphones off her head. "Hey!" She sat up and attempted to snatch them back. "You know the rules," I hissed. "No music before 5. "Dad doesn't care," Lily whined. I stared at her gobsmacked. Dad doesn't care? After everything. How could she say that? Sure, things were weird right now, but she knew. She knew he'd be back to normal any second. Why poke a sleeping bear? I shook my head disappointingly. "No music." Lily stood up on her bed and stared down at me. "You're going to just be like him if you keep that up." Her words stung. I just wanted to protect her. "He's been there all day, you know," she added, sitting down again. "And I asked Mom if I could listen to music, and she told me to ask Dad, and he said sure, right in front of her." As I digested her words, she snatched her headphones back, tucked them over her ears, and laid down with her back to me. I sat on my bed. What the hell was going on? I was too afraid to verify what she claimed, and didn't really believe it, so I just waited for the eventual stomp down the hallway. But it never came. At 6, Lily and I went into the kitchen for dinner. 2 places were set at our little round table, just like breakfast. We had a nice pork chop each and a heap of vegetables and mashed potato. Dad sat before his empty plate. Mom was nowhere to be seen. "Heya," he said. "Hi, Dad," Lily replied. I admired her ability to just go with it. We sat down and began to eat when beckoned to do so by Dad. Eventually, it was too much. I had to ask, "Dad, where's yours?" My voice always came out so meek when talking to him. I hated it. He sniffed. That was a tell of his. When he was getting angry, just like a pig, Mom told me one night after his tantrums. Just like a pig. "Don't worry about mine. Just eat. Eat up and..." "Darling!" Mom's voice rose from their bedroom down the hall. Dad's face dropped, like I'd never, ever seen. He went pale. His lips quivered into a smile directed at me. "Is it nice?" "Mm-hmm." I continued to eat. Lily was staring between us like a tennis match. I couldn't sleep after. I lay in bed in the dark with butterflies stabbing my stomach. Something was very wrong. I hadn't really talked to Mom since the day before yesterday. It was like she was avoiding us. And Dad, what the hell was happening there? "Are you awake?" Lily's whisper interrupted my thoughts. "Yeah." "Okay, good night." I sat up on my elbows. "Lily, when you talked to Mom before, how was she? Was she okay?" I asked as quietly as I could. Voices traveled in this house since all the doors were taken away. "She seemed okay, I guess." "You guess? Did she have bruises or... I don't know. She never turned around." So that was it. He'd beat her up real bad, and now he was playing nice for a little while. I fell asleep worrying. The sound of dishes woke me up early. I immediately got up, hoping to get Mom alone before school, but it was no use. Dad was already there, or maybe he never left. He looked a little bit gray, a little bit sweaty. For the first time in my life, I decided to be brave. "Mom," I said. She didn't stop washing up. "Mom, I have to talk to you. Alone." Dad eyed me. "Not now, baby," Mom replied. "Mom, please, I have to talk to you." "Darl, maybe you should talk to her," Dad suggested. Mom froze. It was so funny, so strange. Dad being the one to walk on eggshells. He sensed she wasn't happy behind him, and out came that pitiful smile again. "Please." "Darling, you don't speak to me, remember?" His smile faltered. "You can't keep me here." "Leave then," Mom replied quietly. I backed up. Any minute now. Any minute and he'd... "Please. Please. Please," Dad grit out. "I'm sorry. How many times do I have to say it? What can I do?" "You can sit there, just like you are," said Mom. Her voice was so clear, so unafraid. Dad pounded his fist on his plate. It shattered and he cut his palm but didn't care. I jumped and almost ran. "You bitch," Dad whispered. "I should have smashed your head all the way through. But you did, darling. Don't you remember?" It was too much. I didn't understand. So I ran outside, still in my PJs, ran to me and Stu's favorite hideaway. Lily came and found me hours later, and we walked home in silence. "Dinner's at 6, Mom said from the sink when we entered. Since then, I've just gone with it. The both of us have. Lily even put a party hat on Dad. Mom makes us food, she cleans the dishes, and we do the rest. Everything. Down to paying the bills with Dad's money. I haven't seen her face in so long, and Dad never leaves the table. He's beginning to stink. I had been feeling it for days. My mouth ached and spiked with pain. It started low and slowly got worse, as if someone was holding my jawbone above a slowly rising campfire. For the first day or two, it was easy enough to ignore. In fact, I couldn't feel it at all if I was focusing on something else. It was always the worst at night, and I would toss and turn unless I popped some Advil to help take the edge off. My dentist had been hounding me to get my wisdom teeth removed for almost a year at this point. So after a few days of suffering, I caved and made an appointment for a few weeks later, to my insurance premium's dismay. As days inched past, the fire burned ever hotter in my mouth. I rubbed my tongue over my gums in my cubicle like a dog staring at a steak, desperately trying to focus. I'm usually a deep sleeper, so I was surprised that one singular crack woke me up in the dead of night. Apartments settle, and I have neighbors. Life is no slasher movie, and I desperately needed the rest, so I ignored it. I know hindsight is 20/20, but be honest with yourself. What would you have done? And besides, I never would have guessed what was happening, so it wouldn't have mattered. The next morning, I was poring over emails and memos and ran my tongue over my inflamed gums. There was something different about my little self-soothing exercise today. I started to notice these little bumps all along my gums. They were spaced out almost evenly, shaped almost like a fingernail, poking up at me from just beneath the surface. Everything feels so magnified when it's in your mouth. A small bite of food can be enough to choke on. The small tug of braces can seem unbearable, and I was always surprised by how small my baby teeth seemed when they fell out. Maybe that's why I decided to call back into the dentist. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I was justified. But I was freaked out, regardless. Johnson Family Dentistry, how may I help you? A woman's voice bubbled through the phone after the first ring. Hey, this is... Name redacted. I'm supposed to get my wisdom teeth removed this weekend, but I think something is wrong. Oh dear, what's wrong? Her voice contained just enough urgency to let me know she shared my concern, and that helped me calm down. Oh, I wouldn't worry about that, she bubbled over the phone once I finished explaining my situation. She explained that it was likely swelling caused by my wisdom teeth fighting for space in my mouth. I need to make sure not to take any over-the-counter medication in the 48 hours leading up to my surgery, and that everything would be fine. She also assured me that they would be more than happy to arrange for emergency surgery if the pain became too severe. As if. Too much of this was coming out of my own pocket in the first place. The pain got worse. I was sleeping less and less. The popping and cracking at night got louder and more frequent. I searched the walls and ceilings for fissures and put in a call to my landlord. I had switched out my tongue for the meaty part of my thumb, pressing against the protrusions that I swore were moving and growing. I told myself to trust the professionals. It was just swelling, but they felt so solid that was hard to believe. Regardless, it was Thursday night. I had practically made it. I knew I could hold out for 2 more days and went to bed, foregoing my usual regimen of various nighttime and PM painkillers. It was as if thunder cracked in my mouth. The searing pain jolted me awake and forced a gasp from my lips. Lashing out with my arm, I grabbed my cell phone and flicked on the front camera. A thin trickle of blood was making its way down my lower lip and began to drip down my chin. I opened my mouth. My lower left canine had split down the middle, ivory flecked with pink blood. A surprisingly spongy interior. Blood pooled in my mouth, washing my tongue with its iron-tinted taste. Every shallow breath brought a new stab of pain. Fit. I managed the expletive as I muttered the expletive by speaking without closing my mouth. I must have been grinding my teeth all night and somehow broke this one. I touched my fractured tooth gingerly, but it still made me flinch. I pulled the chain on my bedside lamp, partially illuminating the walls of my bedroom. The next pop was practically deafening. My tooth exploded into small slivers, flying out of my mouth like shrapnel. The pain was even worse than a moment ago. The popping and cracking came closer together and more intense. I had no choice but to fall onto all fours on my bed. A war zone raged in my ears. Razor-sharp fragments of enamel and bone sliced up my tongue, cheeks, and throat. The trickle of blood falling from my gaping mouth intensified into a scream, flowing out of me and staining my sheets a dark red, spotted with fragments of teeth and flesh. As my body continued to tear itself apart, I felt an enormous pressure building in my lower jaw and the roof of my mouth. Something was tearing its way up through the mangled remains of my gums. The pain and pressure continued to crescendo. My jaw began to bend until, with the loudest crack yet, it broke. I woke up with my face stuck to the sheet and covered in dried blood. I slowly ripped my face away from the bed, reigniting the pain in my fractured jaw and leaving some hair behind. Slowly and shakily, I got to my feet and looked in the mirror. Where my face wasn't covered in blood, it was gaunt and white. My jaw jaggedly broke down in a diagonal line away from the rest of my face. Despite the pain, I forced my mouth slightly open. Everything tasted like rotten meat and metal. Where my teeth once were, and under a thick layer of coagulated mucus-like blood, were 32 molars. Cupid's mouth is a genetic condition that affects 1 in every 2.5 million people. I was born with 2 sets of teeth like everyone else, but as I got older, I developed a third comprised entirely of molars. My jaw was crowded with new teeth until it broke. My soft palate stretched until it tore. After reconstructive surgery, getting the molars filed down, having veneers put in, and yes, getting my wisdom teeth removed, you can barely tell what happened. Cupid's mouth is rare, extremely rare, but there are no genetic markers, no way to tell if it's dormant within you. Check your mouth. If you find any bumps, don't panic. It's probably just swelling. I've lived in Arizona for the past 15 years of my life, but I had a very different life before that. I used to live in a small town in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't even tell you what side of the country it's on, or if it even is in the United States. It was a small forest town with dense trees in all directions. But where exactly this particular forest is, well, your guess is as good as mine. The only thing I know for certain in the name of the town, Point Pine. I lived in Point Pine for the first 10 years of my life, before we moved the summer after my 10th birthday. Once we left, my parents never spoke of it again. In fact, they acted as if it never even existed. And to them, I guess it didn't. I don't really blame them either. I caught on pretty quickly and realized that they were trying their hardest to forget the memory of Point Pine. Whenever kids at school asked me where I was from, I simply told them I was from a small town that they had never heard of. I also learned early on that any questions about Point Pine would be met with punishments. A few months after we moved to Arizona, my older sister Felicity had a school project about family history. She did it on our life in Point Pine and wrote about some of the things she remembered from there. Our mom found her project the day she turned it in and burned it in the backyard. When Felicity came home that afternoon, my parents took her up to her bedroom, where I heard Felicity crying out every few minutes in what I assume was pain. I said nothing, and from that moment on, neither of us mentioned Point Pine again. Except for me, right now. I've decided to tell all of you about it. I don't know what is causing me to remember all these things that I had locked up in the deepest parts of my brain. Maybe it's the fact that my father died about a week ago. Since he died, my mom has remained silent, hasn't said a word to anyone. She hasn't even cried. In fact, she ended up sending my father's remains off to God knows where. My money is on Point Pine, although I'd be crazy to ask. I've started recalling random little things about the town that, at the time, seemed like normal everyday things that we as residents were all used to. Now, as I look back, I realize they're not as normal as I thought back then. One peculiar thing about Point Pine had to do with a Point Pine bakery. Whenever you went in there, the owner, Mr. Terrence, always knew what you were about to order. I remember the kids having some sort of rumor about Mr. Terrence being a magician who could read minds. Also, whenever you paid for your baked goods, you had to tip Mr. Terrence with an old item of clothing that you had grown out of. There was a giant box up by the register that everyone tossed old baby clothing and shoes into. That was one of the odd things, although you'll come to realize that it won't seem that weird in comparison to some of the other things about Point Pine. Every year on your birthday, you had to get blood work done. I don't think anyone really knew what the point of this was, or if they were actually looking for something. We just all knew that our birthdays would start off with a trip to the Point Pine labs. Everyone had to be up at 8:13 a.m. There was a system of speakers placed around the town like an amusement park or something. And at 8:13 a.m., without fail, the wailing alarm sound would ricochet through the neighborhoods, waking everybody up. This was followed by parents running to wake up their children and get them out of bed as quickly as possible, like the house was on fire or something. Sometimes, I expected it to be. All the Point Pine schools were placed in different areas of the town. Point Pine Elementary was towards the east side. Point Pine Middle School was in the west. Point Pine High was in the dead center of town, and Point Pine University was up on a small hill towards the south. If you hadn't noticed by now, every place in town was named Point Pine blank. The Point Pine Cafe, Point Pine Mall, Point Pine Grocery, etc., etc. Certainly one of the weirdest things by far that took place in Point Pine was the Point Pine Monthly Parade. It happened every month, without fail. It was never on the same date, and each month, a student from Point Pine High was chosen to be in it. The weird thing about this parade was that we weren't allowed to watch it go by. Not out on the streets, not from the windows, and not even on television. That was one of the most enforced rules. You must never, under any circumstance, look at the parade. In fact, for the most part, we weren't even allowed outside when the parade passed through. We always knew when the parade was about to start because it always happened the same way. You would hear a chorus of voices like a church choir singing a melody. It wasn't a familiar one that I knew. I was only familiar with it in the sense that I heard it once a month. It sounded like it could be from a nursery rhyme or something similar. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was like they were coming from the sky, from the ground, the trees, the buildings, like everything in Point Pine was singing. Once you heard the first note, you had 5 minutes to get inside a house or a building that had locks on the doors. This might come as a surprise, but in Point Pine, not many buildings contained locks. So if you happened to be out and about on the street when the singing started, you had about 3 options on the places you could go. One of the schools, the staff break room in the Point Pine bar, or the fridge in the Point Pine pizza shop. One year in the month of August, my friend Lee and I decided that we were going to break the rules and not go inside when the parade passed. Now that I think about it, I'm surprised that kids didn't do this more often, considering that, well, when you tell kids they must absolutely never do something, they often do that exact thing. Since we didn't know when the parade was coming, where it started, or the exact path that it took around town, we decided the smartest thing to do would be to wait in the forest near the Point Pine Library until the parade eventually came down that street. So we basically decided to spend about half of the month of August hanging out near or around the library. Around the 3rd week of the month, while we were sitting on the steps of the library talking about some random things that aren't important, we heard the music start. Lee and I looked at each other and then took off running into the trees. While everyone else raced to the nearest school, we went far enough into the forest that someone on the street wouldn't see us, but stayed close enough so that we were able to still see a part of the road. We waited for a while, whispering to each other and then shushing one another as we waited for the infamous parade to pass. This year, my sister's friend Reed was chosen to work on the parade. She was a few years older than my sister, but they were friends because Reed used to live next door to us when we were younger. We were crouching in the bushes and leaves when we heard the chorus of voices getting louder and therefore closer. "Dude, I totally see it," Lee hissed. I straightened my back a little bit in my crouched position to try to see what Lee was seeing. I was always a short kid. Even now, I'm shorter than most guys my age, or any age really, so Lee always pretty much towered over me. I can't see anything," I hissed, shifting my position. "Shh, they might hear us," Lee hissed. I stopped moving and instead waited for them to get closer, where they were bound to pass right in front of my line of sight. "Oh no! Oh crap!" Suddenly, Lee dove to the ground, landing in the fetal position with his head cradled in his hands. "What?" I asked, looking from him to the street. "I saw her. I saw that girl," he exclaimed. "Reed?" I asked, looking over to try to spot her. Lee grabbed me and slammed me to the ground. "Ow!" I exclaimed. "What was that for?" I asked. "You don't want to look at it," Lee replied. I noticed that for the first time in all of the years that I had known him, Lee looked absolutely terrified. I turned my back on the parade and sat down to look at Lee instead. "What did you see?" I whispered. "Those things. They did something to her. They're eating her, Cody. But she doesn't even care." I looked at Lee, who still had his head in his hands, and he was crying now. I sat with my back to the parade, no longer wanting to see it. I heard the singing getting louder. "Cody," I heard the voices calling. "Don't look," Lee whispered. "Cody. Cody." Now the voice sounded like Reed. "Look at us, Cody." I shut my eyes. The voices went on for a few minutes longer, and at one point, Lee started wailing. I kept my eyes shut the entire time. After that, it moved along and continued its way through town. Once we began to hear everyone coming out of their hiding places, I stood up and leaned down to help Lee get up. Once he stood up, he kept his head down. "Lee, what's wrong?" I asked. I could hear him sniffing. "Lee?" He finally responded as he lifted his head. "It took my eyes." I will never forget the dark, bleeding holes in Lee's face and the cuts around his skin. I threw up in the forest for a good 3 minutes before I was able to help lead Lee out of the forest. A few adults saw us and got our parents, who came and got us right away. The day after that, my family moved out of Point Pine. I never knew what became of Lee after that day. Minutes after we left, my parents acted like Point Pine never existed. It was never discussed, and I never had the nerve to ask about Lee again. As far as I know, Lee was the only person who ever saw the parade, and he was never able to see anything after that. I don't know if Point Pine still exists. I'd like to go check it out again, but even if I knew where it was or how to get there, I don't think I'd ever go back. I have a feeling that I wouldn't exactly get a warm welcome. Although, I can't shake the thought that my parents were somehow still connected to the town, even after all those years. Only the dampened, drawn-out creaks of floorboards sounded as I tiptoed to the front door. It was the dead of night, silent as a grave, and it smelled like one too. The air was heavy and rank, as if it too had died. 1 foot down, shifting my weight, the other up. A slow wooden groan, then repeat. Skip the one with a pockmark in it. That one's the loudest. They wake up every time I step on that one. I inched my way to the front door, then took a deep breath, held it, and reached for the doorknob. Turning it up, not down. It let off a faint click and I pulled the door out. Fresh air hit me, soothing, and I breathed it in deep. It soothed me too much. I screwed up. The door groaned as I pulled it just the slightest bit too hard, and though it was no louder than a weak cough, my entire being cringed. My breaths quickened. Something rustled behind me. I knew what it was. I closed my eyes. Tendrils snaked around me and pulled. The world faded to black. I awoke to the dim light that was sunrise in my hell of a home. It was never brighter than a moonlit night, even when the sun was out, like a coffee filter had been placed over the sky. Groaning, I sat up and winced as I recalled my mistake the night before. Twisted flesh, jagged, and blacker than night itself hung in front of me. Bright orange eyes peered out, floating on the mass, freely moving across its entire body. I would have been startled, but after God knows how many years, the terror of it had become numb. That one with the shifty eyes, was 3. He was, as his name implied, the third thing I had ever encountered after crashing at sea. Like the others, he could not speak any human words, but he did have an uncomfortable tendency to whistle. His 2 eyes fixated on me, and a tendril shot out, propping up my head. Another, carrying a glass of water, gently approached my lips, and I drank from it, as I did every morning, trying to avoid his terrible gaze. A faint, dissonant tune came from his being, seeping into my bones. The look of him, the touch, that I had gotten used to. But the sad, slightly off-tune melody he offered me every morning never failed to set a chill into my spine. 3 left, and like clockwork, 2 drifted in. Like a pool of fog, it swirled along the floor, drifting toward me as a cloud in the sky would. I held a breath, out of a perpetual fear that I'd accidentally inhale the monster and let it lift me. I never knew quite what it did during that time, as I always shut my eyes, but part of it was changing my clothes, always the same black set of robes, never any variety, and I don't even want to begin thinking about where they came from. I was, per the schedule, free to roam my run-down little room after the morning ritual. However, any further than that, in one, would come for me. The first few weeks I tried to escape every chance I got, and one would always find me wherever I ran, and shake his mangled face at me. I think on some twisted level they're trying to protect me. None of them, not even one, has ever harmed me in any way, and outside the cabin lies a dead sea of wood and bones. But after some unknown amount of time had stretched away from me, living alone in a cabin full of terrors, their intentions didn't matter. I've begged them to let me leave, even if it meant dying slowly, as long as I'd get to die outside of the decaying walls of their putrid little home. If I don't get to see my family again, or my friends, or play the guitar, or anything else that makes life enjoyable, then why am I even alive? I wish I could tell them that, but they just don't understand. It's clear that there's only one way out of that hell. It involves a lot of swimming. The sea took me there, and the sea can take me home. Or it can take my life. The day crawled by as I was forced to spend it in my little wooden dungeon, full of its creaking rotten wood and traitorous books filled with empty pages. I suffered the unending loneliness, the mind-numbing boredom, and stayed awake this time. Napping during the day only made me groggier at night, and if I'm groggy, I make mistakes like I had the night before. There are no more of those to afford. The time finally came after yet another day of eternal emptiness. I decided it was finally the day, one where I either get out, or I never wake up again. I meditated a few moments, steadying my nerves and breaths, and once the moon smudge poked over the horizon, I began. Weight on the toes, one before the other, light on the step, then slowly applying 8. Skip the 3rd, 8th, and 10th floorboards, hug the wall down the staircase, over the pockmarked board, turning the handle up, and not letting the fresh air dull my razor-sharp awareness. I didn't close the door behind me this time. Creeping down the stone porch steps, onto the path of decrepit tiles that led to them, I kept my breath held. Then, stopping on the last one, I breathed deep twice more and picked up a snapped femur from the ground, and ran faster than I ever had in my entire life, this time not into the dead forest, but towards the ocean on our left. I heard him. I heard one clambering across the ground, scattering bones and dirt and twigs, but didn't look back. All my weight pressed forward, every step as long as possible, until one's footwork grew nearer. Then I turned, stopping quickly, and thrust the bone into his mangled, furry body. A mouth on his midsection filled with jagged brown teeth wailed. I turned to rain again, just a few more feet, and jumped off the low cliff. The shock of cold bit at my skin and I gulped for air, but used every ounce of my will to try and swim as far as I could. One's wailing faded behind me, but I did not look back. There was no going back. It wasn't long before I could no longer progress, or even stay afloat. The world faded black and I sank, swallowed by rough waves of water black as ash. Something pulled me out. My eyes peeled open like someone had glued them shut long ago. There was a strange heaviness and glow to the world, and I was wearing white. When did two ever dress me in something white? No, two would never do such a thing. I was no longer in my hell. The smell of wet wood and old porridge was gone, replaced by something lighter and floral. I felt sunlight on me, real sunlight, not something muted and fake, and welled up without even realizing it. I was free. There was a vortex of gasps and murmurs around me. A woman, I think, approached, cradling my head, holding up a cup of water. Her eyes were as wide as her smile. She whistled Three's favorite tune.